So you've learned about how atoms are the building blocks of matter. And atoms they have electrons, neutrons, and protons. When we talk about electricity, the main characters are going to become the electrons and the protons. Now in the middle is where we have the protons, and on the outside we have the electrons. Electrons are much, much smaller and they can be lost. A common one that's lost, for example, is on sodium. This electron will be lost, and often the chlorine will take that electron. So it'll be a transfer electron, negative electron. Chlorine would then become negative, and sodium would become positive. If atoms become negative or positive, or molecules, they're called ions. The positive ion is called a cation, and the negative ion is called the anion. Now, in this unit on electricity, we're going to move away from talking about ions in charged atoms or molecules, and we're going to talk more about charged objects. So a charged object versus a neutral object. These are two words you're going to hear come up quite a bit. So we have a charged object and a neutral object. This sweater tends to give away electrons, but right now this sweater is neutral. And the way we would know this, it's made of atoms. So a plus and a minus, everything is equivalent. So we have 6 pluses and 6 minuses. So the protons equal the electrons, and it's neutral. But if something were to rub against it like a balloon, the balloon would probably take its electrons, and it'd be more like this. So in this case we have 6 protons, the positives, and 4 electrons. So if you subtract that, that would give us an extra 2 protons, an extra 2 pluses. And so this would have a net charge of being positive, so a net positive charge. So we would call this sweater charged, and it's positively charged. It is not neutral. If it does not have a charge, it's neutral. If it has a charge, it's either negative or positive. This sweater, on the other hand, picked up some electrons, which tends not to happen, but this is just an example. So it picked up this electron and this electron. So in this case, we have 8 negatives and 6 positives. So this would be a net negative because we have 2 extra negatives. So this sweater's charged, this sweater's charged. And we would say this is positively charged, negatively charged. And you might hear that also called net negative or net positive. The net is just the total of the positives minus the negatives. The word net is used in a lot of other ways. For example, if I made $2, so I'm going to put a plus I made, and I spent $4, I have a net of negative $2. Later on we will see there are 4 primary ways that an object can become charged or become neutral. An important thing to remember about charge is something to do with polarity. So this right here is a neutral object. But later we'll find out that sometimes electrons will be made to move across the item and create what is called polarity. If all the electrons were to move to this end, so all 6 electrons were to move, and the positives are protons, they're too large to move, but they will be left with a partial negative side on this side and a partial positive side on this side of the object. So the object is now polar. But is it charged or neutral? Well, because the electrons match the protons, so there's 6 electrons and 6 protons, this object is actually neutral, but it's polar. And this polarity can actually be reversed. So we can go back to this. We can go back and forth. And you'll see how later on. But if we lose an electron or two, they are lost, and we'll talk about how that happens later. We now have 2 protons that are not counterbalanced by electrons. We have 6 positives and 4 negatives. So this would then be considered charge. This would be a net positive charge. So this is neutral but polar. This is neutral but polar. And this is a net positive charge. the same concept is true for an atom. So if I have in the middle 2 protons, 2 neutrons, on the outside 2 electrons. So this would be a neutral atom, right? Neutral. But sometimes the electrons would be induced to be on one side only. And if that were to happen, we don't lose an electron, but we do have a partial negative side here. So this now is on this side. So this becomes partially negative. And this side would become partially positive. This atom at this point would be polar. It is not charged. Now, if the atom loses an electron, let's say it keeps one, it now becomes positively charged. It is now a full ion. It is a charged ion. Or if the atom were to gain an electron, it is now negative, and it is a negative ion called an anion. This is a cation, this is an anion. Both of these are charged. To recap, we learned that an atom made of neutrons and protons and electrons can become ionized. So this would be a cation, and if this electron was picked up by another neutron and proton of a different atom, this would take a negative charge, be an anion. We learned that an object can be neutral if the pluses and minuses balance, the protons and neutrons balance, negatively charged if the pluses and minuses do not match. So this has 2 protons and 4 negative electrons. Or positively charged. We also learned the word net charge is basically what we just said there, is negative, positive, or neutral. It's negative if the negatives outnumber the positives, and it's positive if the positives outnumber the negatives.